Welcome. You're listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Lori Lee Binstock, host of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network and anywhere you get your podcasts. Today's guest is Dr. Haley Arias, doctor of chiropractic medicine, assistant professor of biology, and a business owner. She's also the author of her debut children's book, When I Can't See You. It was born out of her own personal tragedy and childhood grief following the death of her older brother. With this book, she hopes to foster a sense of imagination in children as they search for their own answers throughout the confusion of their loss. Dr. Haley, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you, Lori Lee, for having me. I really appreciate it.
Of course. I'm so excited to kind of delve. I know it's a difficult topic, but I feel like it's a really important one because children do experience loss. I know I did, and I know at some point they will. And I think I truly explaining grief to children can it be very difficult for some parents, especially if they didn't have anyone kind of talking to them about it. But this was I love that you created this book and it's been born out of your own experience of losing your brother. Can you explain a little bit about your story and how you got to publishing a book?
Yeah. Well, I'll almost work it backwards because, yeah, that's where the idea came from is when I was a child and I experienced the loss of my older brother in a car accident. So it was very sudden and of course shocking. But um, during COVID, my husband and I were undergoing fertility treatments. And we lost several babies along the way. And it was one of those situations where I thought, um, I mean, you do IVF, you pay a bunch of money, you're like supposed to be guaranteed a baby, right? And that's not what happened. And so I remember, it's already during COVID, it's already isolating, and it's a weird time. And I remember sitting on our back porch, and I'm journaling, and we had just lost our first baby, and I'm just staring at the stars, and it just kind of hit me. Oh, I remember this. I remember being 11 years old and not knowing where to look and not knowing, um, where to. I wanted something tangible. As a kid, you're like, I want this thing. I'm used to this person being in my life, and now they're not, and this not this tangible thing anymore. And I grew up in a really Christian household, and so I knew about heaven, but it was so abstract, right? And it didn't, that wasn't clicking for me. And so I just I'm like, "That star, like, that's my brother," and so it really my whole life, I was 11 years old when I lost my brother, and then, my whole life, I'm like, "Oh, that one, like, that's him," and if I needed to talk to him or, that's how I kinda coped, and it was funny that here I am in my 30s, and I'm like I feel like that little girl all over again, and I'm staring at the stars, and I'm like, "All right, which one are you? Because 'Cause I'm not ready to let you go. I'm not ready to, um, give up on that." And so that is sort of where the book was born out of was, yeah, I came up with the concept as an 11-year-old girl. But man, it hit me like a ton of bricks when I was, in my 30s and I lost another baby or lost a baby and then another and so I'm like, if this is helping me as an adult, don't I need to like share this? It felt like something that it didn't feel right not to share. So
Oh,
that's
absolutely.
kind of where the book was born out of. It kind of became now what are you going to do with this pain? How are you going to share it? So
Yeah, and
that's my long-winded answer to your.
that's great, and I really do think people really they search within themselves. They create something that they needed themselves, kind of thing.
Absolutely. I heard that not too long ago, actually. Um, Rick Rubin, the music producer. I think I heard him on a podcast or an interview or something, and he said, "Don't try and create things that you think other people need or you think other people want. Create things that you need and it'll resonate." And I'm like, "Man, that's exactly what happened here. I needed this and I needed to put it down on paper and never really thought it would go anywhere. And then all of a sudden it did, and it is touching people and it is reaching families and in a bigger way than I could have ever imagined."
That's so beautiful.
Yeah,
And did you feel that, because it seems like you're still you were still
sure.
processing it with this book, I feel like was an amazing way to do that, and really honor your brother. But when the tragedy happened, you were 11 years old. How
Mhm.
did you cope? Like, did you feel like the people around you, your caregivers, your parents, gave you the space that you needed to cope?
That's a good question. I feel like yes, and I feel like everyone in my family, I'm the youngest of four, so I also have two older sisters, and then my older brother and my parents, and I felt like everybody was kind of doing the best they could, and my parents did. We had their resources, and they got me into counseling, and things like that. But I think everyone kind of splintered off and coped the best they could. And one thing that I didn't see my family do was kind of come together to grieve and to talk about things and to try and process it together. And that was something that I didn't realize until I was older, um, that I really needed, and that I think kids or families really need. Because I was told one time, it could, tragedy and grief can do one of two things. It can break families apart, or it can really fracture families, or it can bring them closer. And I think as kids, it's already a traumatic loss whenever we experience any kind of loss, whether it's a grandparent or even a pet, or but there's already that loss. And the best thing we can do is come together, but oftentimes, many times parents don't even know how to do that. They don't know how to process their own grief. And so with this book, for me, it was, how can I give parents and kids this almost bedtime story where they're having to talk about it and they're kind of having to discuss it together. And it doesn't have to be some big conversation, but just those little conversations that keep keep the lines of communication open within families was kind of what I was going for. And so for me at 11, there was a lot of I journaled a lot. One thing that I found that I've reflected on was starting to help others. It always, I felt almost, I don't want to say like special, but I was the only person my age that I knew that had lost somebody like that in their immediate family. And so when I would see other people, whether it was adults or, older people in my church or community would lose somebody, I almost felt like it was my job now to talk to them or send them a card or a letter or something. And it gave me kind of a purpose in that, and it really made me feel like if I'm helping through, and I can say this now as an adult, but as an 11-year-old, I wasn't thinking it. I didn't have that thought process, but I was already trying to help to heal my own self. And I think that kind of became a through line too throughout my life, after losing my brother. Then we lost my dad, whenever I was 20 to suicide.
Oh
And
gosh.
so, it kind of felt like the hits kept coming, and it became well, what are you going to do with that? That question again, like, what are you going to do with it? Are you going to help other people, or are you going to kind of sit in your grief stew?
Mhm.
Which I did some of that too. Don't get me wrong. But that's kind of how I started processing as a kid, and that kind of continued.
That's incredible, and I'm so sorry. It does seem like you've experienced an extreme amount of loss. I know you just mentioned 2 people who are your immediate family.
Right.
Um, when you lost your father, what was that like for you after having lost your brother?
That one, it was so suicide's kind of its own kind of loss.
Mhm.
It's very it's so layered, right? It's not just this natural event that we think of, like this accident that my brother had, or an illness that, and we do know now, like, yes, oftentimes that comes from mental illness, but especially at that time and growing up in the South, it was very, we don't talk about this, I didn't know anybody really at that point that either had died by suicide, or uh, any people who had lost anybody that way. And so not only was it shocking, it was there was a lot of embarrassment around
A
it
lot of shame.
too, a lot of shame, a
Mm,
lot guilt that comes with that. I'm 20 years old. I'm in undergraduate college, and I'm living it up. I'm having the time of my life. And there was a lot of guilt that I didn't know a lot was going on with my dad. Now I can see. Of course I didn't know. And oftentimes we don't know.
right.
Um, you know, my mom was doing the best that she could with the situation, uh, and knew some things, but she still didn't know a lot. There was a lot of hiding, and a
Yeah.
lot of just secrecy around it. And so there was with that, there's just been a lot of healing because, as an 11-year-old, and they say kids are really resilient. I can somewhat agree with that. I think as kids, a lot of times we are able to accept easier, and maybe not question for as long. But at 20 years old, that to me was it really shook the foundation. It really shook my
Mm,
foundation as like a young woman, um, making decisions on my career and my life and what's coming next, and always having this father that was very present in my life. All of a sudden he's not, and that's by choice. That's a
wow.
hard thing to navigate. But again, it became something that, how do we use this to help other people? How do we not hide from it? How do we, I think it's Brene Brown that always talks about, like, when you get it out in the light, it's, that shame loses its fuel a little
Yeah.
bit. And so that's kind of for me, it was, how can I not talk about this? This is a huge part of my life. It I learned that it doesn't define me, but it was a defining moment in my life. How can I not talk about this and be real about this? Um, Otherwise it keeps you kind of in that shame spiral.
Yeah. Did you
But
feel immediately that you felt okay with sharing what had happened? Or did it take time? Because I feel like, especially like you were saying, especially, back then,
yeah.
you don't talk about mental health. You don't touch, suicide. You just pretend it's like you pretend it didn't happen. But
Well, yeah, and you hope, you think if we don't talk about it, it won't happen again, or that
right?
situation too. Yeah. I think it probably took some time to really, other than my close-knit circle, it took some time to be able to, I already felt like, oh, people know. people
Mm,
know this about our family. And, that felt really unstable. Like, do they want to talk to me, or do they feel bad for what happened to our family? I'm sure there was a lot of all of that. But when I went away to college a couple months after my dad passed away, it was so nice because I was hours away and nobody knew. That
mm,
was like that clean slate. Um, but it was interesting as time went on, and friends' parents are coming to visit at college, or, and they start asking about your family, and then,
right.
you know, kind of lie about it, or kind of tell a little bit of it. And then it's like, well, that doesn't really feel good either. So because it's informing, that loss of my dad was informing so much of the choices I made, right?
Wow.
So many of the choices I made on my career and things like that. So um, yeah, it became something that I felt almost obligated to share.
Wow. Yeah. And when you did it feel like weight was lifted? Did it feel like you were still in this shame spiral?
No, I think it probably lifted a lot, right? I think
That's
it was
awesome.
one of those things where, you share and you're like, oh, maybe that wasn't so bad.
Yeah, because you're not holding it. You're not
Right.
holding so much in your key, you when you share it, like Brene Brown says, if there's not as much darkness. Darkness is so much heavier than light.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow. And so did any of that, your experience with your father's death also inspire your book as well?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's all there, right? And even at 20 years old, I kind of remember thinking, well, it might be silly, but there's my brother Neil, and like, okay, I'll just put dad right beside him. Um, and so it's interesting how becoming an adult, you're like, I kind of have this little crew up in the sky that I can revisit and I can talk to, and it just feels like I can see them. And so I think um, at some point that starts, instead of it being so sad and so tragic, of course, time helps that, but it becomes really comforting.
Yeah.
Like a
Anytime you
really,
want, you can just look out at night.
right.
That is really beautiful. I
Yeah.
think that is inspiring, and I love how you talked about earlier about, children are resilient and they can be, but I do think resilience does come with some validation, some being able with support. I feel like, you know, at least on the surface, I think if for children who've experienced trauma, they can kind of push that down, but eventually that will come back up. And you seem like you have processed it, but when another tragedy came up, or, it came up, and then it helped you
Absolutely.
process.
Absolutely. And I think that's, not to sound so cliche, but I think that's how trauma is, right? You think you've dealt with something so well, or you think I'm done with that, right? Or,
Right.
I did the years of time on that, but yeah, something else happens, and then you realize it is like layers of an onion,
Yeah.
and it really, and I think it's just like any wound. If you don't address it, it becomes infected. It starts festering. It will spill over into other aspects of your life. And for a long time, it certainly did that, and there's probably still some of that. I get really scared of loss. I get really scared of losing the people close to me. I have to kind of keep that in check when my husband travels on his own, or goes and does anything on his own without me. That always comes up, and
Wow.
I'm like, all right, we got to kind of keep that in check, because that could just derail me.
Right, right. It could be
And
debilitating. You can be asking him not to leave, and
right.
that could be that could be its own problem, right?
Absolutely. He could be like, "Ooh, all right, this is not what I signed up for."
I mean, I think that's exactly and trauma really does that. It, like you were saying, it just kind of comes up and it can be debilitating if you don't keep it in check, like you said, or address it and confront it. Um, did when your brother passed, you mentioned, they this whole construct of heaven. They talked about this construct of
Mhm.
heaven that didn't feel tangible. It just seemed very abstract. Um, Was that something that they wanted you to hold on to? Or did you ever share with them that that just didn't feel like enough?
Mm. I don't think I've ever shared that probably until now,
Ugh,
actually.
really?
Um, because I've never yeah, it was one of those things that just felt, "Okay, so people die, and then that's just it." Like, they just it was almost to me like, "Okay, so they just evaporate, and then that's it," and I know, like, that is it. I know they're not, here anymore, but it was just something that my younger brain couldn't fully just accept that. I just
Yeah.
needed something else, and maybe it helped that I created it for myself instead of
Mhm.
someone telling me that this is how it is and this is what we need to think. I think that probably helped a lot too,
Yeah.
where I felt like maybe I had some control of the situation in some way.
Yes.
Being told all of these things, I'm being told like, this is how it goes and blah, blah, blah. And then, my brain is going, like, "But I just don't like that. And I don't want that to be all."
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
maybe I need to create something. And so that's with the book, almost giving kids permission. It's okay to think about other things. It's okay if you want to make them a star, it's okay if this butterfly that you keep seeing that you want to say, like, yeah, this is grandma. Like, that's fine. If that's what's helping you right now and making you feel like maybe you have a little control, maybe control's not the word, but it maybe feeling like you have a little control in this situation. I think that's okay.
I do love that because that was your purpose for the book is
Right.
having giving them their sense of imagination of what they feel is safe for them to heal through this grief. Right.
And that permission.
That
Right? Like,
permission.
it's not because the truth is, you can believe whatever you want to believe, but at the end of the day, we just don't know.
We
So,
just don't know,
there's so much
right?
we just don't know, so, of course, I just think it doesn't hurt anything for a child to hold on to something like that if that's helping them right now, and, that's why I think having the children's book, having parents read that with the children at night or, anytime, have those conversations. It's okay for the adult to maybe slow down and maybe relax a little and think that too.
Exactly.
And it's kinda giving the adult or the parent or, whoever in this situation, that permission as well. It's okay to say, "I just don't know, and right now, this fits and it feels good." So,
Yeah.
with that.
Yeah, I mean, because the way one person looks at something is not going to be as comforting for another. I
Sure.
mean, I have to say, my parents, and from my culture, I'm Filipino, but like my mom, but my parents, their belief, like I felt like they thought it was comforting, like when my grandfather passed away, to say, don't worry, he'll come visit you and all these things. And I think I was around 11 years old. And I'm like, that sounds terrible. I don't like in my head, I'm like, he's going to be a ghost. So I couldn't sleep at night. Like, am I going to see a ghost? Am I going to see the ghost of my grandfather? They're like, it's okay because it's your grandfather. I'm like, no, I'm not okay. I'm not
Yeah.
okay with this. And I had some really I had some issues with like grief and
Yeah.
death, and I feel like that really 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 made it difficult. There was one person who said who talked about what they talked to their children about, and they, they're like, okay, well then they go back into the earth, and then the earth fertilizes the soil helps trees grow, the trees create oxygen, and then that is we breathe these people in. I was like, that sounds so much better than a ghost just visiting me at night, you
Oh,
know?
beautiful, yeah.
I thought it was beautiful. I was like, that I'm going to use that. I'm going to use that because that's fact. Like they do,
Sure.
right?
Mhm.
Um and so I feel like the way you kind of share or discuss grief with your children really really matters, and I love that your book really opens up like what makes you feel like
Mhm.
you can cope with this and
Yeah.
make you feel safe. And I just love that, because I feel like
Yeah.
the control, like telling somebody what is happening or what is going on is it just doesn't feel right.
Right. Well, and that's part of it too, is I think as parents, and I can see this, I give my parents tons of credit, nobody has a playbook of like when you lose a child, now how do I still raise these other kids? And how do I mean, I yeah, that's a horrible thing. The worst loss is, they say losing a child. And so I don't fault my parents, but what if they could have just stepped back and said, yeah, like let's whatever works for all of us, and have those conversations and
Mhm.
not feel like, because I think that's, as a parent myself, oftentimes I get caught in I have to have the right answer. I'm supposed to know. I'm supposed to know, I'm supposed to be able to tell him how this goes or have, and the truth is I don't have a clue a lot of times about a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, and I think that is the beauty of being able to say, wherever your imagination takes you.
Yeah.
Yeah, because
Yes.
exactly, there's no truth in like all of these things that we tell ourselves, like in
Right.
heaven. And so, like I really do appreciate that, where it's, just accepting the fact we just don't know.
Yeah.
We just
Yeah.
don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of those things that probably as you get older, you get more comfortable saying, I don't know. You want to try and figure this out together? Or what do you think?
Yes.
And I think there's that can provide that validation that you were talking about, like to kids, at least their opinion matters, or at least
Yes.
one thing that, there's just been things that have come out of this book that I never thought of. There's one family that we know, they have actually a couple copies of the book because they have a couple of kids. And so they each have their own copy. It's really
Oh.
cute. And for Christmas, they had just lost their grandfather. And
Mm.
so for Christmas, the parents bought them a telescope. And so so from the book, they've decided they want this star to be Papa, and so they bought a telescope and they're doing that together at night, and they're looking for him. And if it's a cloudy night and they can't find him, they just know that he's resting tonight, and I'm like,
I
how
love that.
beautiful that they are. I never thought that, there's just things like that that are um, coming of it that I'm like, that's so beautiful. And how cool to turn that into a fun family activity, right? Like it
Mhm.
doesn't have to be so heavy and,
And
I
sad.
just thought that was really cool. They recently shared that with my husband and I. And I'm like, wow, see that creativity that I've in
That you
imagination, taken it so much further.
I love that. And
It's
I
really
think,
cool.
and that's the thing. That's the thing, when you like give that space for imagination, then it just grows and
Yeah.
grows, and it doesn't have to be constrained to this one idea.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. Wow. Well, I'm just is there anything that well, you said you have a son?
Yes.
Yes. And so how do you feel that you would address I don't know if you've dealt with any grief with your child. Um, if you have or haven't, what have you done? And what do you hope to do should they experience this?
Yeah. So we did finally get our baby boy through IVF.
Congratulations.
Thank you. He is just a little over 2, and um, yeah, we're in all things toddlerhood right now, which is like craziness on its own. But so we haven't really experienced grief yet. There's not been anything I've had to explain, but I think about it a lot. I think about that with grandparents um and I'm so grateful that I do have this book and that it's a reminder to me to make that okay for him to ask questions and kind of come up with things on his own. But that's what I anticipate, if and when that time comes, which I'm sure it will. That's, the circle of life. But yeah, I'm grateful that if for nothing else, I put it on paper for me, to
Mhm.
remind myself or when those times come because um it all sounds good when I'm talking about it and I want to be able to stand in that as a parent too when that time comes.
Yeah. Well, I feel like you're almost an expert on it. For children, I think that's wonderful. I think just, the I think the main thing is just fostering that imagination that which is the goal of your book. And I think that is such a beautiful thing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's sort of that. Yeah, I'm an expert because of the repetition kind of, but I do truly believe, um, and it's taken me a long time to feel this way for sure, but I do truly believe that going through all of these losses and having all of this pain, there comes a point in your life when you realize, as awful as all of this was, is it now a privilege? Because is it a privilege to now have that pain and that experience that I can hold
Mhm.
the hand of others? I can have compassion. I can not just have sympathy, but real empathy with other people. Um, because it's so easy, I think, to get stuck in the like, why me? And, what did I do to deserve this? And I definitely went through that big time. But at some point, I had to say, it totally sucked. All
Yeah,
of this sucked. But what am I going to do with it now?
exactly.
And like I said earlier, I can't just like sit in my stew, my grief stew. I got to do something with it. And so that's kind of what my whole career and my whole life has kind of turned into is finding, with my chiropractic practice, it was attracting all of these clients that had real trauma and real grief and pain when I thought I was having an athletic practice. And like
Wow.
I'm attracting these patients they have real grief, and real trauma that's stored in their bodies. And I'm like, okay, well, that's not really what I was wanting, but
That's
here
what you
they keep
got.
coming. So,
That's what they needed from you.
sure. And and I'm like, man, I these are some hard cases but that and then um I've done a I've done a lot of work in creating programs for families of suicide loss.
Oh,
Because
wow.
for us, specifically, there was grief counseling, and I mean, my dad died when, well, that was 2007, so that was quite a while ago. And I think mental health care's come a long way. But for me at the time, I was like, I can't just sit on a couch and keep talking about this.
Mm.
It's not, it's almost it's almost like deepening the wound, right? It's almost not that sharing it didn't help, but it was almost like I'm not getting out of it,
Mm.
I'm not. And so I think so there's been, EMDR and more
Wow.
physical things that have come with like mental health care that are so amazing. But for me, what I wanted to do is I want tangible things for these survivors of this suicide loss, these families left behind. Because if they don't have that, like I said before, I think suicide's a really specific type of loss, and the grief process and the questions and everything around it are pretty unique.
Yeah. Yeah.
And for me, I thought I need some tangible things to do. I need some tangible resources. So, creating these programs with modules that have these are your takeaways. These are things to do when you start asking these questions or you start, getting in that shame spiral. This is a journal that is specifically for your type of loss because you know, I understand sometimes with just a blank page is a little too much, so here's some prompts that through research, we developed that, you know, these family members feel or um, questions they have, and so some journal prompts and so as I look back on all of it, I'm like, man, all of that was really, really hard, and I wouldn't wish it on anybody, but at the same time, I'm able to create and be and hold the hand of people that have experienced this loss in a way that I didn't have.
Right. Wow. I mean,
So
then there's your next book, your prompt, your a workshop book for suicide or loss. I mean, I think
right.
that is necessary and needed, and I mean that's amazing. Did you say that you went through EMDR?
As a patient many times. Yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Wow. Yeah. And was
It's
that
oh,
was
sorry, go
that
ahead.
for your the loss of your father or both or just
Well, yeah, it's the loss of my father initially, and then of course, like we were saying, and then you get in there and you're like, oh wow, there's still some more stuff, a little
R-
deeper now. But I was amazed at EMDR. I'm
yeah.
amazed at y- y- just that, like I said, that tangible. I'm doing something with my body. I'm doing something to reprogram, and it's not just talking about it. And I would say that along with exercise, like physically moving my body, I believe that like, move your body, move a thought type
Mhm.
thing. Um, I would say are the biggest game changers, right?
Wow. Yeah.
For that trauma for me. Yeah, EMDR is I can't say enough good things
It's like
about.
it's like magic. It feels like,
It
right?
totally is. I'm like,
Yeah.
this is not fair that this hasn't been around forever.
Right, and that it's still I feel like people still don't know about EMDR. And
Yeah.
and for listeners, I know I've talked about it several times, but it's eye movement desensitization or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing.
Yes.
Yes, just so
Beautiful.
so it's great. It's a great tool for trauma. I feel like it's so underrated.
Absolutely. I feel like people still think, well, it's a little out there. I don't really need that. I just need a therapist to talk to. And I'm like, no, you probably need that. You just
Yes.
don't know you need that.
Especially if you've experienced such a trauma, like an event trauma or anything. Like it is it it can be a lot. Sometimes you're just like,
Yeah.
wow, I'm just pulling all kinds of stuff that I didn't like you were saying.
Totally. Well, and the really popular book, The Body Keeps the Score,
Yeah.
right? I'm so glad that that is available to the layperson
Yeah.
to really start understanding what trauma does to the body and understanding that there you've probably undergone a lot more trauma than you are giving yourself credit for a lot of times. And it truly gets stored on a cellular level, and your body has to
Mhm.
do something with that. And I just think EMDR is one of those things that um, it is really allowing people to truly clear things
Clear
um,
things out.
from
Yeah.
their bodies, and that's another thing with my chiropractic. I only see a handful of patients very selectively, but I work with a lot of patients they've had a trauma or they've had a grief, and they always have this back pain or they always have this thing going on in their body that it's not clearing. And so it's how can we truly meld that like mind and body, and I always tell people, I'm like, get at least 3 sessions of EMDR and then come back to me and now we
Let's do
can,
the body work.
yeah.
So I'm curious because chiropractic medicine,
Mhm.
that you are a doctor of chiropractic medicine. Did you know that, like, I guess you said that you just started seeing these trauma patients, but after you did EMDR and you did read The Body Keeps the Score, like, did you feel like that was going to be your calling when these people came to you, or
Well, it was kind of the inverse. It was like these people
okay, yeah,
started coming to me, and they'd come to me for an injury, right? And and I live in Durango, Colorado, and we say this is the land of the weekend warrior. I mean, there are just runners and hikers and
right,
crazy skiers, just crazy athletes here. So, these people would come to me and they think they had like a sports injury or like a running injury or something like that. And then as I started digging deeper, and okay, but it's been going on a little bit longer, and then you realize there's like a lot more going on there. That's not that's not just you stepped wrong on the trail, or that's not just, and it might be an overuse injury, but why is it an overuse injury? What are you
right,
from? What is, and so kind of unpacking some of that, and realizing, well, my regular technique of, this is this, and just the biomechanical technique kind of wasn't getting results for some of these patients. And I'm like, well, I'm going by the book. I don't understand why. And it's when I kind of stepped back and stopped making it so about the body, and okay, well, so much grief resides in the chest and along the lung fields, and we hold our breath and we try to hold it in, and I'm like, well, I know like your hips bothering you, but what if we look here? What if you go
oh,
with me here? Can we look somewhere else today? And then that starts helping people. And so it wasn't until much later that I got a hold to, the Body Keeps the Score book. I'm like,
that's what happened. That book is amazing.
it's
Highly
amazing.
recommend. Highly
I
recommend.
say people should read it once a year.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
remind
Just a
themselves.
reminder, like this is some of these symptoms are just
Yeah.
you've gone through some trauma. And so I mean when I remember when I read, I'm a childhood sexual abuse survivor, and I remember I went into treatment and they were like, we want you to read this book. And when I read it, I was like, these are all of my symptoms for abuse.
Check,
And
check.
I was blown away, and I was like, okay, I need to learn more. And then I went through EMDR, I did, and it
Yeah.
saved me. So
Yeah.
yeah.
It's
Wow.
amazing. I'm so grateful for those resources. And I'm so grateful for conversations like this where and what you're doing and what you're putting out in the world and having real conversations with people. Because I think I just going back to what we said before, like the more light you shed on stuff, the less power it has.
Right.
Secrets and trauma festers in the dark. And I just
Yeah.
like if we can talk about it and share it. I remember saying years ago, if I can save one family from having having to walk the same path that I did, whether it's through my chiropractic practice or me speaking somewhere or, this book, then it was all worth it. And I truly feel like that. Like I truly feel like our stories have so much power, and have so much healing power for others. And I think, every time we tell it, we heal a little bit more too.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing all of this information. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I don't think so. I think I dumped a lot on you.
No, it would what a wonderful conversation. I really do appreciate
Yeah,
having this conversation and just sharing so much. It's very powerful. It's very
thank you.
powerful.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for, your time and for, allowing this little book to get out in the world a little bit more. I'm really, really grateful.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. What a wonderful book. Well,
Thank you.
thanks again.
Yes, thank you, Lori Lee.
That was Dr. Haley Arias, doctor and author of the children's book When I Can't See You. For more information on Dr. Haley and where you can purchase her book, you can check out the show notes. April's issue of Authentic Insider is out at traumasurvivorthriver.com. That's traumasurvivorthriver.com. You can also check out past issues of Authentic Insider and past episodes of a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast. If you haven't already, please subscribe to my email list and you can get Authentic Insider magazine in your inbox monthly. You've been listening to a Trauma Survivor Thrivers podcast on Mental Health News Radio Network. I'm Lori Lee Benstock. Thank you so much for being a part of the conversation. Take care.